They believed their calculations were sound. On the morning of December 7, 1941, as 6 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed through the dark waters 230 miles north of Oahu, the men aboard those ships operated with confidence born from careful planning. Admiral Nagumo commanded the strike force. His staff officers reviewed the final details. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had made the crossing from Hitokapu Bay in complete radio silence, maintaining operational security across 3,500 miles of open ocean. At 6 o'clock that Sunday morning, the first wave of aircraft began launching into the pre-dawn darkness. 183 planes lifted from the carrier decks, their engines roaring as pilots formed up for the attack. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida led the formation toward their target. The United States Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese admirals who planned this operation understood what they were attempting. They were striking a nation with 10 times Japan's industrial capacity, a country that produced more steel, more oil, more of every material resource necessary for modern warfare. But they had calculated the risk. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor Plan, had studied in America, had served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial power. Yet he and his fellow planners believed they had found a solution to the disparity. If Japan could destroy the American Pacific Fleet in one decisive blow, if they could seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia before America could respond, if they could establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, then perhaps they could force a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. The plan was audacious, but not irrational. It rested on assumptions about timing, about American will to fight, about Japan's ability to consolidate gains faster than America could rebuild its fleet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By 7:55 that morning, Hawaiian time, the attack commenced. Japanese bombs fell on Battleship Row, on the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler and Bellows. Torpedoes modified with wooden fins to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow 42-foot depths struck the hulls of battleships moored along Ford Island. The USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, detonating more than 1 million pounds of ammunition and killing 1,177 men in an instant. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping 400 men inside her hull. 21 ships of the Pacific Fleet were sunk or damaged. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2,403 American servicemen and women died. Another 1,178 were wounded. The second wave of 170 aircraft arrived at 8:54 and continued the destruction for another hour. When the attack ended shortly before 10 o'clock, less than 2 hours after it began, the American Pacific Fleet had been devastated. The Japanese strike force withdrew, having lost 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. By any tactical measure, the operation was a spectacular success. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had achieved complete surprise, had inflicted catastrophic damage, and had escaped without significant loss. Japanese naval aviators had demonstrated their skill and their equipment's effectiveness. The planning had been meticulous. The execution had been nearly flawless. Back in Tokyo, naval staff officers received reports of the attack's success with satisfaction. They had struck the Americans before they were ready. They had removed the Pacific Fleet as an immediate threat to Japan's southern operations. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces were landing in Malaya, attacking the Philippines, seizing Guam and Wake Island. The conquest of Southeast Asia's resource zones proceeded as planned. The admirals who authorized Pearl Harbor believed they understood the strategic situation. Japan needed oil, rubber, tin, and other resources to sustain its war in China and to maintain its position as a great power. Those resources lay in British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and other European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. America had placed an embargo on oil exports to Japan in August 1941, cutting off 94% of Japan's oil supply. Japan's leaders faced a choice. They could submit to American demands to withdraw from China and abandon their imperial ambitions, or they could seize the resources they needed by force. They chose war. The calculations seemed straightforward. America's Pacific Fleet was the primary obstacle to Japan's southern advance. Remove that obstacle through a preemptive strike, seize the resource zones before America could respond, establish defensive positions across thousands of miles of ocean, and force the Americans to accept the new reality or face a costly war across the Pacific. Japanese military planners studied the potential conflict carefully. They knew they could not match American industrial output in a prolonged war, but they believed they did not need to. If they could achieve decisive victories early, if they could make the cost of reconquest prohibitively high, if they could maintain interior lines of communication while forcing the Americans to fight across vast distances, then perhaps they could outlast American will to continue the war. It was a gamble, but it seemed like Japan's best option given the strategic situation they faced. The admirals had precedents to support their thinking. In 1905, Japan had fought Imperial Russia and won. The Battle of Tsushima had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet and forced Russia to accept a negotiated peace despite Russia's vastly greater population and resources. One decisive naval victory had ended that war on terms favorable to Japan. Perhaps another decisive strike could produce a similar result against America. Japanese military leadership had also observed that democracies sometimes lacked the will for prolonged conflict, particularly when fighting far from home. They believed American society was soft, divided, focused on material comfort rather than martial values. Perhaps the Americans would not have the stomach for the kind of grinding combat that would be required to reconquer the Pacific Islands one by one. Admiral Yamamoto himself was less certain than his colleagues. He had warned Japanese political leadership before the war began. In 1940, when asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe about prospects for war with America, Yamamoto had stated, "If we are ordered to do it, then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." In September 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, he had made another prediction. "For a while we'll have everything our own way, stretching out in every direction like an octopus spreading its tentacles. But it'll last for a year and a half at the most." Yamamoto understood American industrial capacity in ways many of his colleagues did not. He had seen the automobile factories in Detroit, the oil fields in Texas. He knew what those factories and fields represented in terms of productive capacity. He knew that if America chose to mobilize fully for war, Japan's industrial base could not compete. But Yamamoto's warnings were noted and set aside. The decision for war had been made at the highest levels of Japanese government. The embargo left Japan few options. War seemed inevitable. And perhaps, the other admirals reasoned, perhaps Yamamoto was being too pessimistic. Perhaps American will would break before American industry could be fully mobilized. Perhaps the defensive perimeter could be made strong enough to make reconquest impossible. Perhaps. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically, but it contained critical failures that would prove decisive. The American aircraft carriers were not in port that morning. USS Enterprise was returning from delivering Marine aircraft to Wake Island. USS Lexington was delivering scout bombers to Midway. USS Saratoga was on the West Coast undergoing maintenance. The three carriers that formed the core of American naval aviation in the Pacific had escaped destruction by accident of scheduling. Admiral Nagumo chose not to launch a third strike against Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair docks. He had achieved his primary objective of damaging the battle fleet. His carriers had been at sea and exposed for days. American carriers were somewhere in the waters around Hawaii, location unknown, a potential threat to his force. He ordered withdrawal. Those fuel tanks and repair facilities would prove crucial in the months ahead. But these tactical details, significant as they were, mattered less than the fundamental strategic miscalculation. The Japanese admirals who planned and executed Pearl Harbor had successfully awakened American industrial power, had united American public opinion for total war, and had set in motion a response that their calculations had failed to account for adequately. They had started a war they believed they might win through limited objectives and negotiated peace. What they actually started was something entirely different. The response that unfolded in the months following Pearl Harbor was something Japanese planners had anticipated in theory, but underestimated in scale. President Franklin Roosevelt had already begun mobilizing American industry before the attack. In May 1940, he had challenged the nation to produce 50,000 aircraft per year, a figure that seemed impossible at the time. The goal exceeded the total of all planes built in the United States since the Wright brothers' 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk Imperial War Museums. But Roosevelt understood what modern war required. Industrial capacity would determine victory. The aircraft industry in 1939 had been small, fragmented, producing fewer than 6,000 planes annually. In 1940, production reached 12,804 aircraft. In 1941, 26,277 centennial of flight. These were substantial increases, but they represented only the beginning. The real transformation occurred after Pearl Harbor galvanized the nation. Factory construction accelerated. Automobile plants converted to aircraft production. Shipyards expanded. Steel mills increased. Output. The entire industrial apparatus of the nation shifted toward war production with a speed and coordination that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. One facility exemplified this transformation more than any other. In April 1941, construction began on what would become the Willow Run bomber plant, built by Ford Motor Company on farmland between Ypsilanti Township and Belleville, Michigan. Wikipedia. The government had awarded Ford a contract to build B-24 Liberator heavy bombers under license from Consolidated Aircraft. Henry Ford, though an isolationist who had opposed American involvement in the war, accepted the contract. His company would apply automotive mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. The scale was unprecedented. Architect Albert Kahn designed the main structure with 3.5 million square feet of factory space National Museum of the United States Army. The building stretched more than half a mile long and a quarter mile wide at its widest point. One pundit referred to it as a sprawling mass of industrial ambition imperial war museums. The assembly line inside ran over a mile, including a distinctive 90-degree turn. Ford production executive Charles Sorensen had conceived the layout after visiting Consolidated's San Diego plant in January 1941. He had been appalled by what he saw there. Aircraft were being built like custom products, each one individually crafted with minimal standardization. Sorensen stayed up all night in his hotel room, sketching a different approach on the backs of placemats. He envisioned breaking the B-24 into major sub-assemblies that could be built in parallel, then brought together on a moving assembly line. It was the same principle that had revolutionized automobile production, now applied to 4-engine bombers. The challenges were immense. Engineers discovered that engineering drawings for the B-24 were incomplete and filled with discrepancies and unfamiliar signs and symbols. An unknown number of specifications dwelt only in the memories of plant foremen at consolidated Imperial War Museums. Ford had to send 70-man teams of engineers on 2,300-mile trips between Detroit and San Diego repeatedly to understand how the bomber was actually built. The B-24 was not designed for mass production. It had been designed by aircraft engineers who thought in terms of craftsmanship rather than interchangeable parts. Willow Run struggled initially. In only 1 month during 1942, Ford hired 2,900 workers, but lost 3,100 Wikipedia, E.S. Navy history. The plant was nearly an hour's drive from Detroit. Wartime gasoline and tire rationing made the commute difficult. The transition from automobile to aircraft production proved harder than expected. Willow Run only assembled 56 complete airframes in 1942, far short of expectations, National Geographic. Critics called the facility "Will It Run?", questioning whether Ford's experiment would succeed. But the problems were solved through methodical engineering. Ford created a permanent jig for assembling the B-24's center wing section, into which wings could be moved by overhead crane. Consolidated's method required 250 man-hours. Ford's needed one, the National World War II Museum. Similar innovations occurred throughout the plant. By 1943, production accelerated dramatically. In January 1943, Willow Run produced 37 planes. By February, 70, March, 96. April, 146 centennial of flight. On November 3, 1943, employees celebrated as Willow Run turned out its 1,000th finished B-24 bomber, the National World War II Museum. By 1944, Willow Run had achieved what seemed impossible. Ford was rolling a Liberator off the production line every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, National Museum of the United States Army. At its peak, Willow Run employed more than 42,000 people. The National World War II Museum, the workforce included men who had been automotive workers, bringing their manufacturing expertise. But it also included thousands of women, many working in heavy industry for the first time. They welded armor plate, assembled turrets, installed engines, performed every job except the heaviest lifting. The industrial mobilization had tapped a workforce previously excluded from heavy manufacturing. Willow Run was one plant among many. Housing its central production facility in the Willow Run bomber plant, Ford produced a combined total of 8,685 B-24 Liberators, with production running from May 15, 1942 to June 28, 1945, National Geographic. But B-24 production occurred at 5 different facilities operated by 3 companies. The total exceeded 18,000 aircraft. And the B-24 was just one type among hundreds. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, produced at multiple plants, accounted for more than 12,000 aircraft. The Douglas C-47 transport exceeded 10,000. The North American P-51 Mustang fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat naval fighter, all were produced in thousands. Total American aircraft production for 1941 reached 26,277 aircraft. In 1942, 47,836. In 1943, 85,898. In 1944, 96,300, 18 centennial of flight. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These were not just numbers on production reports. Each aircraft represented aluminum that had been mined, refined, shaped, steel that had been forged, engines that had been manufactured with precision tolerances, instruments, radios, weapons systems, all requiring their own supply chains. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war, including 297,000 aircraft airplanes online. The United States was not just arming itself, it was supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and smaller allies. The industrial mobilization extended beyond aircraft. America launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan did in the entire war. Shipyards turned out tonnage so fast that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced airplanes online. Tank production, artillery production, truck production, all occurred at similar scales. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, another massive facility, was producing Sherman tanks at rates that exceeded Japan's entire tank production. Everything was being produced in overwhelming quantities. For Japanese military planners receiving intelligence reports about American production, the numbers must have seemed impossible. In 1941, Japan produced 5,088 aircraft. The United States produced 19,433 Pearl Harbor. Japan's production was roughly 1/4 of America's. That disparity widened dramatically in subsequent years. In 1942, Japan produced 8,861 aircraft, while America produced 49,445. In 1943, Japan managed 16,693, while America reached 92,196. In 1944, Japan's production peaked at 28,180 aircraft. America produced 100,752 Pearl Harbor. In 1944 alone, the United States built more aircraft than Japan did throughout the entire war. Wikipedia Kiddle. By 1943 and 1944, a large portion of both Japanese and German production consisted of single-engine fighters. The United States was producing large numbers of 2-engine and 4-engine bombers, including the B-17, B-24, and B-29, as well as twin-engine transports Axis and Allies Pearl Harbor. American aircraft were larger, heavier, more complex. A single B-29 Superfortress required more aluminum and more manufacturing hours than multiple Japanese fighters. The weight differential revealed the true gap. American production emphasized heavy bombers and transports. Japanese production focused increasingly on fighters as the war turned defensive. A B-24 weighed 36,000 pounds empty. A Japanese Zero fighter weighed 4,000 pounds. Comparing aircraft numbers understated the disparity in actual manufacturing capacity and resource consumption. The United States was producing not just more aircraft, but vastly more capable aircraft, requiring far more materials and labor per unit. Japanese industry could not match this output. In December 1941, Japan had 10% as much industrial capacity as the United States Pearl Harbor. The resource embargo that had precipitated the war meant Japan needed to conquer and hold territories producing oil, rubber, tin, and other materials. But even with access to Southeast Asian resources, Japanese industrial capacity could not expand fast enough. American submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them, cutting supply lines between resource zones and home islands. The factories that did exist struggled with material shortages, design changes, quality control issues. The aircraft Japan did produce often reflected these constraints. Designs emphasized simplicity and ease of manufacture over capability. The Zero fighter that had seemed so formidable in 1941 lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. These features had been deliberately omitted to save weight and complexity, allowing the Zero to outmaneuver heavier opponents. But the design philosophy assumed Japan would maintain air superiority. Once American production delivered superior numbers and newer designs, the Zero's vulnerabilities became fatal. Pilots died in aircraft that offered them no protection. By September 1943, Japanese military planners at Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive assessment of their strategic situation. They recognized their greatest weaknesses were in aircraft and shipping, and without these they could not hope to halt the Allied drive, much less open an offensive of their own. The National World War II Museum, the total number of aircraft required by the Army and Navy during 1944 was estimated at 55,000. An impossible figure given that total Japanese aircraft production in August 1943 was only 1,360, and in September, 1,470. The National World War II Museum. Even if Japan could somehow produce that many aircraft, the effort would strain the economy so severely that it would be impossible to match American and British naval forces or build up ground strength adequate to meet a possible Soviet threat or initiate large-scale offensive operations. In China, the National World War II Museum. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Japan entered the war with approximately 10% of America's industrial capacity. That disparity widened throughout the conflict as American production accelerated while Japanese production struggled under material shortages and increasingly effective Allied submarine warfare. By 1943, American production capabilities were overwhelming Japanese resources. Wikipedia. The oil situation alone revealed the hopelessness of Japan's position. Japan began the war with only 18 months of oil reserves, depending on conquered territories that ultimately supplied just 35% of their needs. By 1944, American submarines and bombers ensured only half of this vital resource reached the Japanese homeland. Wikipedia. The capture of Saipan in June 1944 changed everything. The capture of islands sufficiently close to Japan, particularly Saipan and Tinian, seized in June 1944, enabled B-29 seconds, based at airfields there, to bomb the home islands with increasing regularity. Britannica. The 15–16 June 1944 raid on Yawata marked the beginning of the USAAF's strategic bombing campaign against Japan airplanes online. The first raids from Chinese bases had been ineffective, limited by logistics and distance, but from the Marianas, B-29 operations proved devastatingly effective. Strategic bombing raids began in June 1944 and continued with increasing intensity until the end of the war in August 1945. Wikipedia. The B-29 superfortress was the weapon that made this possible. It had an operational range of 3,250 nautical miles and could attack at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where Japanese air defenses struggled to reach them. Almost 90% of the bombs dropped on the Japanese home islands were delivered by the B-29 Britannica. The bombing campaign evolved as commanders learned what worked. Initial precision bombing raids at high altitude proved ineffective due to weather conditions, the jet stream, and the dispersed nature of Japanese manufacturing. In February 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay changed tactics. On March 9, 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding general of the 21st Bomber Command, initiated the all-out mass offensive by low-level incendiary attack Centennial of Flight. On the night of 9–10 March 1945, 334 B, 29 seconds, targeted the Shitamachi neighborhood of Tokyo in a low-altitude bombing raid Britannica. An armada of 334 B-29 bombers followed from bases in the Mariana Islands, with 279 of them dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries, including 500,000 cylinders of napalm and white phosphorus Britannica. The attack destroyed 16 square miles of central Tokyo, killed an estimated 100,000 civilians, and left over 1 million homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history. For Japanese civilians on the home islands, the bombing revealed truths their government had concealed. The war was not going well. The military could not protect them. American bombers flew over Japanese cities at will, dropping incendiaries that turned entire neighborhoods into infernos. Americans encountered for the first time a large population of Japanese civilians on Saipan in June 1944. The Japanese military indoctrinated their civilian countrymen that the Americans would inflict unlimited atrocities on captured civilians and then exterminate them. About 13,000 of about 20,000 Japanese civilians on Saipan perished. Several thousand took their own lives rather than be captured. National Geographic. The propaganda about American brutality served multiple purposes for Japan's military leadership. It discouraged surrender and resistance. It maintained fighting morale even as the strategic situation became hopeless. But it also reflected genuine fear among Japanese leaders about what defeat would mean. After Saipan, top-level American planning documents spoke routinely that an invasion of Japan would confront a fanatically hostile population. National Geographic. In response, in March 1945, Japan mustered a vast additional body of combatants by inducting every single male age 15 to 60 and every single female age 17 to 40. This inducted about a quarter or more of Japan's total population, about 18 to 20 million people. National Geographic. The strategic bombing campaign continued with relentless intensity through spring and summer of 1945. City after city burned. Industrial facilities were destroyed. Transportation networks were shattered. The civilian population faced starvation as food distribution collapsed. As the summer progressed, the emperor and other key members of the inner leadership experienced truly terrifying anxiety that the Japanese people were nearing a revolutionary moment. This was primarily because of the American campaign of devastating firebombing attacks on cities and the increasingly dire food situation. National Museum of the United States Army. Yet even facing this catastrophe, Japan's military leadership resisted surrender. In the early years of the war, General Hideki Tojo held 3 of the 6 positions on the Supreme Council: Prime Minister, Minister of War, and Chief of the Army General Staff. Tojo was arguably the man most responsible for pushing Japan into the war. However, when the Marianas Islands fell to U.S. forces in July 1944, senior Japanese leadership understood that the war was effectively lost. Tojo received the blame and was forced out, having lost face association for Asian studies. The new leadership understood the military situation but could not agree on terms for ending the war. Some favored negotiated peace through Soviet mediation. Others insisted on fighting to the end, believing that inflicting heavy casualties on an American invasion force might produce acceptable peace terms. Through May 1945, Emperor Hirohito believed a major Japanese military victory must precede any move toward peace, or Japan's hopes for something other than unconditional surrender would be vain. National Museum of the United States Army. The emperor changed his position only gradually. As reports indicated, the planned defensive battle on Kyushu might fail, and as domestic conditions deteriorated toward potential revolution. The reaction by Japanese armed forces to President Truman's claim of an atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima was extremely unfazed. This stemmed from Japan's own atomic bomb program. It produced no actual bomb, but it educated top officials that the production of fissionable material to make an atomic bomb was stupendously difficult. Hence, top uniformed leaders refused to concede that the United States possessed more than one bomb, or perhaps a few, but not an arsenal of powerful atomic weapons. National Museum of the United States Army. This reveals how completely Japanese military leadership had lost touch with American industrial capabilities. They could not imagine that a nation could produce atomic weapons in quantity because their own industrial base struggled to produce conventional weapons. The Soviet Union's entry into the war on August 8, 1945, combined with the atomic bombings, finally convinced Japan's leadership that continued resistance was futile. What the Japanese leadership did immediately grasp was that the clock was just about to run out for negotiations. While the US invasion was not expected until November, the Soviets could, in theory, be in Hokkaido in a weak association for Asian studies. The Emperor intervened personally to break the deadlock in the Supreme Council. On August 15, 1945, his radio address informed the Japanese people of the surrender. Most had never heard his voice before. Many could not understand his words, delivered in archaic court Japanese. But the meaning was clear. For the first time in its history, Japan had surrendered to a foreign power. The admirals who had planned Pearl Harbor lived to see the consequences of their decision. Admiral Yamamoto did not survive the war. He died on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville in an operation based on decoded Japanese communications. Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the strike force at Pearl Harbor, died on Saipan in July 1944 during the American assault on the island. He committed suicide rather than face capture. The calculations they had made in 1941 proved catastrophically wrong. They had assumed they could win a limited war through early victories and defensive operations. They had assumed American will would break before American industry could fully mobilize. They had assumed the Pacific's vast distances would protect Japan's defensive perimeter. Every assumption failed. The production numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Japan built approximately 70,000 aircraft during the entire war from 1937 to 1945. The United States built nearly 300,000 between 1941 and 1945. In shipbuilding, the disparity was even more dramatic. American shipyards launched more tonnage in single months than Japan produced in entire years. The Detroit tank arsenal alone produced more armored vehicles than Japan's entire industrial base. This was not simply superior technology or better design. This was industrial capacity operating at a scale Japan could not match or meaningfully counter. The strategic bombing campaign demonstrated this disparity in the most direct way possible. By 1944, America led the world in arms production, making more than enough to fill its military needs. At the same time, the United States was providing its allies in Great Britain and the Soviet Union with critically needed supplies, the National World War II Museum. America was fighting a two-ocean war, supporting allies across the globe, and still had sufficient industrial capacity to devastate Japan from the air with a bombing campaign of unprecedented intensity. 4. Japanese civilians who survived the war, the experience was one of profound disillusionment. Everything their government had told them proved false. The military could not protect them. The empire could not sustain itself. The fighting spirit they had been taught to revere could not stop American bombers or prevent American conquest. They had suffered catastrophic losses, endured starvation and firebombing, and watched their cities burn for a war their leaders knew was unwinnable, but continued anyway out of institutional momentum and unwillingness to accept responsibility for defeat. The industrial workers at Willow Run and the other American factories that produced the weapons that defeated Japan had their own perspective. They had built the tools necessary for victory. They had worked long shifts, adapted to wartime rationing, sent family members to fight overseas. When the war ended, many returned to peacetime production, manufacturing automobiles and refrigerators, and the consumer, goods that would define the post-war American economy. The factories that had built B-29 seconds reverted to civilian purposes. The workforce that had assembled bombers assembled cars. The lesson was clear to anyone studying the war's outcome. The plan was not entirely unrealistic in 1941, but it completely overlooked the American reaction to Pearl Harbor and the refusal of the United States to fight a limited war. The risks were recognized, but the alternatives were not estimated correctly. In the final analysis, the Japanese decision for war was the result of the conviction that the United States was determined to reduce Japan to a position of secondary importance. U.S. Navy history. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not destroyed American resolve, it had unified it. The losses inflicted that December morning galvanized American public opinion for total war. The industrial mobilization that followed exceeded anything Japanese planners had imagined possible. The confident admirals, who launched the strike, had awakened something they could not control and could not defeat. They had attacked the world's largest industrial power and discovered that production capacity, not fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, determined outcomes in modern industrial warfare. By the time they understood this truth, it was too late. The factories were already running. The bombers were already flying. The war they had started with such confidence had become a war they could not possibly win. The mathematics had been clear from the beginning to anyone willing to see them. Industrial capacity matters. Resource access matters. A nation that produces 10 times more steel, 20 times more oil, 100 times more aircraft cannot be defeated by courage alone. The admirals at Pearl Harbor believed they could strike a decisive blow that would force American accommodation. What they actually did was prove that attacking America's Pacific Fleet did not destroy America's industrial base. The ships could be repaired or replaced. The aircraft could be rebuilt in greater numbers. The losses, as devastating as they were that December morning, represented a tiny fraction of American productive capacity. Everything that was destroyed could be replaced within months. Everything Japan lost could not be replaced at all. That was the fundamental miscalculation. That was the truth revealed by the factories in Detroit, by the airfields in the Marianas, by the B-29 seconds over Tokyo. Industrial power, once fully mobilized, was overwhelming. Japan had started a war with a nation that could build 100,000 aircraft per year. The outcome was never truly in doubt. Only the cost and duration remained to be determined. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.